The cold didn't arrive all at once that December. It settled in like a quiet bill you can't argue with. It started with frosted windows at dawn, then crept into the floorboards, then finally reached the old furnace that had carried them through too many winters already. One evening, it coughed, rattled, and went silent, leaving a thin burnt smell that lingered in the hallway. The couple stood in their living room with a space heater humming at their feet, the tree lights blinking on a timer that felt more like a promise than a decoration. They were both 70, and they had learned how to make "we're fine" sound steady, even when the math was tight. This year's stakes were simple and heavy at the same time. Keep the house warm, keep pride intact, and make sure the holiday visit they'd been waiting for didn't turn into another polite cancellation because a home felt like a problem. Thaddeus Keene carried an old kind of skill that most people never notice until they need it. For decades, he had been the quiet specialist who listened to metal the way some people listen to weather, the one call when a vault door refused to cooperate, and no one wanted a crowd watching. Years back, one job with the wrong client had left a stain on his name that never turned into charges but still changed the way people looked at him. Work dried up, invitations cooled, and he rebuilt life the slow way. Steady hours at a hardware store, careful friendships, no risks that could be misunderstood. Maribel watched him age into that smaller world with patience and worry, because she knew he wasn't chasing thrills. He was chasing usefulness. They still had warmth between them, still had routines that held, but they lived with the quiet ache of being one surprise away from choosing between repairs and prescriptions, between comfort and dignity. The idea of a storage auction came in sideways, like most temptations do. Thaddeus was stacking box padlocks when two customers near the counter started talking about bidding on abandoned units, laughing about junk and jackpots, and insisting that the organized ones were the real prizes. One of them mentioned a unit packed with identical totes, sealed like someone cared, and how that kind of order usually hid something valuable. The couple's voices faded when they left, but the thought stayed bright in his mind all the way home. Later, at their kitchen table under the yellow light, the old laptop booted up slowly, fan whining, and Maribel watched him scroll through grainy listing photos, as if he were reading weather radar. Most units looked like headaches, broken furniture, sagging boxes, stained mattresses. Then one listing made both of them go still, because it didn't look abandoned at all. It looked arranged. The unit in the photo was deep and dim, packed not with furniture but with practical clutter. Stacked black totes with bright yellow lids, a couple of taped cardboard boxes, a bicycle leaned sideways near the entrance, and a folded ladder tucked against the wall. In the back corner, half hidden under a heavy canvas drop cloth, stood a tall, squared shape that didn't belong with the rest. The cloth didn't reach the floor, and the exposed base showed dark green enamel edged with thin gold pinstripe, an old finish deliberate, expensive. Thaddeus didn't say safe immediately, but Maribel saw the recognition tighten his jaw, the way his gaze measured the outline like it had weight. The listing text was blunt. Delinquent account, cash payment. 48 hours to clear, no access before purchase. The opening bid was high enough to make Maribel's stomach tighten, close enough to their emergency envelope to feel like a dare. She didn't like gambling, but she liked the idea of their lives being dictated by fear even less. And she could sense the same thing he sensed. Someone had packed this unit like a plan, not a storage dump. They talked it through the way people do when love is older than pride. Maribel kept the questions practical. What if the unit was worthless? What if the safe was empty? What if the risk turned a cold month into a crisis? Thaddeus kept his answers grounded. They would set a hard limit. They would document everything, and they would stop the moment anything felt wrong. Still, a mystery like that is gravity, especially in the season when memories are louder and the future feels close enough to touch. It was a kind of situation that, in the stories people pass around online, makes strangers hit like subscribe and comment with their theories, because guessing is easier than standing there yourself. In their kitchen, it wasn't entertainment. It was a choice with a pulse. In the end, they agreed on one rule that mattered more than money. No secrets between them. If they stepped into this, they stepped together, and they would keep their consciences clean as their hands. Auction morning didn't feel festive. It felt sharp and quiet, with coffee cooling on the table and the space heater clicking on and off beside their feet. The bid numbers rose in small jumps, and a blank profile bidder kept staying one step ahead, as if someone was steering from the shadows with no interest in being known. Thaddeus didn't chase. He waited, jaw set, finger still, because panic was how people lost everything. Then, close to the end, that anonymous bidder vanished from the list in a way that didn't feel like a normal retreat. The timer kept counting down, indifferent, and Maribel's hand found his wrist like an anchor. He placed one final bid inside their limit, not with excitement, but with the quiet courage of someone refusing to be frozen by caution forever. The screen refreshed once, then settled on a simple result. Winner confirmed. They didn't celebrate. They just stared at the words until they felt real, because now the question was no longer what if, but what is? By late afternoon, they were driving to the facility under sky that looked like it was holding snow in reserve. Gravel crunched under their tires, and the rows of metal doors stretched like a corridor of other people's unfinished lives. Inside the office, the manager's friendliness thinned when he saw the unit number, and his eyes flicked up with a quick, uneasy measure before he slid the paperwork across the counter. He explained the rules in a voice too practiced to be casual, then added one detail he hadn't needed to share. The previous renter always paid in cash, always near closing time, and then stopped without a call or a trace. When they asked about the corner where the unit sat, he hesitated just long enough to matter and mentioned the camera coverage was weaker at the far end, as if that had always bothered him too. A brass key on a plastic tag landed in Thaddeus's palm, colder than it should have been, and they walked down the road with their breaths showing in the air, aware that a single roll-up door now separated them from whatever someone had tried so hard to keep locked away. The roll-up door fought them the way old metal always does in winter, shuddering up the track with a dry groan that echoed down the row. Cold air spilled out first, sharp with dust, and a faint smell like machine oil that had been sitting too long. The unit was deeper than the listing photo suggested, and the first few feet looked almost normal for storage. 2 bicycles leaned awkwardly against a stack of taped cardboard boxes. A folded ladder lay flat along the left wall, and several black totes with bright yellow lids were stacked in straight columns like somebody cared about symmetry. A thin layer of grit coated everything, but the footprints near the entrance were lighter than the rest, as if someone stood there often, not years ago but routinely. Maribel felt that detail in her stomach more than in her mind, because it made the place feel less abandoned and more paused. The far corner held the shape that had pulled them here, still hunched under a heavy canvas drawcloth that looked too thick for simple protection. The cloth was cinched at the bottom with a length of chain, and the chain was looped through a padlock that had been cut cleanly and left on the floor. That single cut spoke louder than the manager's casual rules, because it meant someone had tried to secure the object even inside a secured unit. The couple stood just inside the threshold, letting their eyes adjust, listening to the distant slam of other doors and the faint wind moving through the lanes, and both understood that their quiet holiday problem had just been replaced by a different kind of question. They did not rush to the canvas, not because they lacked courage, but because 70 years teaches you to move in steps. The first step was understanding the room. The nearest totes were labeled in plain block letters. Tools, papers, misc. Nothing personal, nothing that anchored this unit to a life with birthdays and family photos. A cheap folding chair sat near the entrance facing inward, wore the armrests, like a lookout point for someone who sat and watched the back corner for long stretches. Against the right wall, there was a small metal desk with one drawer slightly open, a lamp without a bulb, and a coffee mug with dark ring inside that told its own small story of long nights. Under the desk, a portable heater lay unplugged with its cord neatly coiled, as if even comfort had been organized. Thaddeus tested the tote marked tools first and felt the weight tug his wrist down. It wasn't clothing weight or kitchen junk weight, but dense, practical weight. He didn't open it yet. He moved slowly to the desk and slid the drawer out with 2 fingers, expecting receipts or empty wrappers, and instead found a spiral notebook filled with tight handwriting, columns of numbers, short street names, and times written like appointments. Nothing screamed crime, but nothing suggested ordinary life either. Maribel searched the desk surface and found a faint dust outline where a small device had once been, maybe a radio or a phone dock, and beside it sat a charger cord with no device attached. That absence made her throat tighten, because people lose cords, not the things they charge, and the unit felt designed to leave nothing behind that could identify a person. Only then did they return to the back corner together, not touching, just looking. The canvas hung in stiff folds and carried old stains like it had been used on job sites, and the chain around it had rubbed the cloth into frayed grooves where it tightened. Thaddeus lifted one edge carefully, and a small puff of dust rose, catching a thin light like smoke, and the shape beneath resolved into exactly what his eyes had promised him it was. A massive upright vault safe stood against the back wall, painted deep green with a tired gold pinstripe, its corners decorated in a style from another era. The round combination dial sat at chest height, black and numbered, and beneath it a heavy 3-spoke handle weighted like a hand that never let go. The nameplate, Hayward Security Works, was there, worn but legible, and the hinges were external and ornate, built for strength more than elegance. The couple didn't speak for a few seconds because words would have made it feel too real. Maribel's first thought was simply about weight. How a safe like that did not enter a storage unit without planning and equipment. Her second thought was about the chain and the cut padlock, and how someone had wanted the steel to stay sealed even after the unit door rolled down. Thaddeus's hands hovered near the dial without touching, the old instinct waking in his fingers, and he felt both the pull of familiar craft and the sting of memories that had once made him swear he'd never do this again. They backed away and made a plan, because planning was the only way to keep fear from becoming the driver. The most logical explanation was also the one that tightened the room around them. The previous renter had stored something valuable and left no time to retrieve it. A safer explanation was that the safe was empty and the rest was just junk packed neatly, but the chair, the cot-like roll of blanket near the wall, and the stacked food supplies argued against a simple move out. Someone had spent time here, enough time to get tired, enough time to drink coffee, enough time to keep tools and papers sorted in separate bins. That suggested a purpose. The couple agreed to document everything before touching the safe any further, taking photos with their phone, writing notes on what they saw, and keeping each item in its place as long as possible. It was not paranoia. It was realism. Because if something inside turned out to be tied to a crime, their best protection would be a clear, honest record of what they did and when they did it. Maribel's breath steadied a little when they returned the front totes and opened the one marked MISC first, snapping the latches with stiff fingers. Inside were mundane items on top: work gloves, plastic tarps, zip ties, batteries. But beneath those were two small metal cash boxes, both locked, both heavier than they should have been. They set them aside without forcing them. The papers tote came next, and the smell of old ink rose as they lifted the lid. Manila folders wrapped in plastic, photocopied pages with stamped headers, and a stack of envelopes labeled by dates. Some lines were blacked out with thick marker, but even without reading, the official formatting felt like trouble. Thaddeus didn't need the words yet to know these weren't family documents. These are the kind of pages people hide when they don't trust filing cabinets anymore. Halfway through the afternoon, they stepped outside the unit for a short break, letting the cold air clear their lungs and the normal sounds of the facility remind them that the world was still ordinary beyond that door. They sat in the car with lukewarm coffee from a thermos, watching people load boxes into trunks, watching a kid drag a plastic sled across the gravel like it was a sidewalk. Maribel kept her hands wrapped around the cup as if warmth could travel up through her wrists into her heart. She told Thaddeus that this was the point where their grandson would grin and say that if a story matters, you hit like, subscribe, and comment, because support keeps things going when the ending is uncertain. It wasn't a joke exactly, more a way to name the feeling of being watched by fate, and Thaddeus let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. If anyone ever heard what they were living through, they would have opinions, and those opinions would be easy from a distance. In the car, the only opinion that mattered was theirs, and the only goal that mattered was making sure they didn't turn a holiday risk into a holiday disaster. They agreed on a simple rule for the next steps. If anything inside the safe pointed toward danger, they would stop and seek proper advice rather than try and be clever. It was a kind of promise older couples make with a glance, not with drama, and it carried more weight than the safe itself. Back inside, Thaddeus returned to the vault with slow respect, as if the steel could sense recklessness. He knelt on a folded moving blanket to protect his knees, and for a moment he simply placed 2 fingers against the dial without turning it, listening to the silence of the mechanism like a doctor listens to a heartbeat. Then he spun the dial gently through full rotations to clear it, letting his ear hover close to the door, catching the faint layered clicks that most people never notice. The years away from this work had not erased his memory, but they had softened his certainty, and he moved carefully, patient with himself. Maribel sat on the folding chair near the entrance, not crowding him, watching the unit and the corridor beyond like a lookout, because the weak camera coverage the manager mentioned now felt like a real detail with consequences. Attempt after attempt ended with the handle refusing to move, and each time Thaddeus forced himself not to force it, not to turn this into a jam bolt that would cost money and time. He paused, wiped his hands on his jeans, and studied the safe's lower edge again, searching for the small things technicians leave behind. That was when he noticed a worn service sticker partly hidden near the base, the kind that once held a company number and a scribbled note. Most of it had faded, but beneath the peeling corner were 3 small digits written in pen, cramped as if done quickly. He didn't announce it like a victory. He simply noted it, then cleared the dial again, and tried those digits in a sequence his hands remembered from long ago calls when customers wanted the factory setting checked first. The sound that answered him was not loud, but it changed the air. A deeper click came from inside the door, followed by a soft shift like heavy bolts withdrawing the channels they hadn't moved through in years. Thaddeus froze with his hand still on the dial, listening as if he might have imagined it, then slowly wrapped his fingers around the three-spoke handle and leaned in with controlled pressure. The handle moved a fraction, reluctant but real, and the seal along the door's edge gave a faint sigh as if the safe itself had exhaled. Maribel stood up so fast the chair legs scraped the concrete, and she stopped herself halfway, not wanting to startle him or crowd the moment. The door did not swing open on its own. It waited, heavy and patient, requiring a decision rather than a tug. That was the thing about old vaults, and about old lives too. Sometimes the hardest part is not the mechanism, but the choice to look inside. Thaddeus held the handle without pulling, because his mind suddenly filled with the weight of what could be there: documents, cash, something illegal, something that didn't belong to them in any moral sense, even the auction contract said otherwise. He glanced toward the unit entrance, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement in the corridor, a shadow passing slow, then gone, as if someone had paused to listen, and then decided not to be seen. Maribel stepped closer, not into his space, but close enough that he'd feel her steadiness beside him. She didn't ask what he planned to do, because the answer lived in his shoulders and the tight line of his mouth. He took one careful breath, then pulled. The vault door opened with a slow, stubborn swing, metal sliding against metal, releasing a colder smell than the unit itself. Paper, oil, and something faintly chemical that didn't belong in a family home. His phone flashlight cut into the darkness and revealed shelves inside, arranged with the same deliberate order as the totes. On the top shelf were bundles of cash and brittle rubber bands, stacked like inventory, edges aligned with unnerving precision. On the middle shelf sat a flat leather ledger, and a cigar tin filled with coin capsules that caught the light like small eyes. On the bottom shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the unmistakable outline of a handgun, and beside it sat an old black phone placed dead center, as if it mattered more than the money. Thaddeus did not touch anything yet. He simply held the light steady while his pulse climbed, because this wasn't a lucky find anymore. This was a system, a private archive, a hidden life sealed in steel. And as they stared into the open safe, the old black phone screen flickered once, faint, brief, like a dying ember, then lit up fully with two words that made Maribel's stomach drop: unknown caller. The old phone didn't ring with cheerful tone or familiar melody, just a dry vibration that seemed too loud inside the steel-lined silence. The screen glowed against the safe's dark interior. Unknown caller, hovering there like a test neither of them had studied for. Maribel's first instinct was to reach for it, to make the noise stop before it drew attention, but Thaddeus lifted a hand and held still, listening the way he once listened to metal. The unit felt suddenly smaller, the roll-up door too far away, the cold air too thin. He watched the call timer tick without answering, not from bravado, but from a simple rule he'd learned the hard way. When something rings from a secret place, it rarely brings good news. The buzzing stopped, then started again almost immediately, as if whoever called expected obedience, not hesitation. He angled his own phone toward the screen and snapped a clear photo of the display, the signal bars, the faint carrier name, anything that might matter later, because proof was the only comfort left once fear arrived. Maribel kept her eyes on the aisle outside the unit, her body angled like a guard at the door, and when the caller finally gave up, the quiet that returned felt worse than the sound had been, because it left them alone with the question of how someone could be calling a phone sealed in a vault that had not been opened in years. They didn't start grabbing money, even though the bundles on the top shelf could have changed their life in one afternoon. Instead, they moved with the careful discipline of people who have spent decades stretching budgets and counting risks. Thaddeus slid the leather ledger out first and opened it only enough to see the structure: columns, dates, amounts, short labels written in a hand that stayed calm even when the numbers climbed. Words like consult, delivery, and cleanup appeared beside initials instead of names, and certain entries were circled twice, as if meant to be found quickly. Beneath the ledger, the cigar tin of coin capsules looked almost harmless until the flashlight caught the clean edges in the typed labels. Years reaching back into the 1800s, grades marked in neat abbreviations, dealer names that hinted at real money and real documentation. Maribel lifted the watch box with both hands, the way people lift something fragile and expensive even before they know what it is, and the weight alone made her swallow. The handgun stayed wrapped. Neither of them touched it, because the presence of it changed the tone from valuable to prepared. When they found a row of manila folders behind the cash, thick with photocopied reports bearing official seals and blacked outlines, Maribel's fingers tightened around the paper edges, as if the documents could cut her. Whatever this safe was, it wasn't a retirement fund. It was leverage, preserved with the kind of attention that meant the owner expected trouble and planned to survive it. The inner compartment at the back was the moment the story turned darker. A small keyhole glinted in the flashlight beam, and the metal around it was scarred, as if someone had opened it often and fast. Thaddeus worked the lock with the same quiet patience he once used in his trade, not forcing anything, listening for the tiny give that meant the pins had settled. When it finally turned, the bolt slid back with a soft metallic sigh that made Maribel flinch despite herself. Inside sat a narrow, unmarked box that looked ordinary until he lifted it and felt the weight pull his wrist down. They set it on the moving blanket and opened the latches together, and what lay inside didn't sparkle like treasure, but it shifted the air in the unit the way a bad memory does. 3 passports, each with the same photograph and 3 different names. A tiny digital recorder sealed in a plastic bag with a date written on tape. A wire-button microphone, the kind that disappears under a shirt. A second, smaller ledger packed tight with notes and times that read like meetings, not errands. Tucked beneath it all was a folded slip of motel stationery with 4 simple words in block print. If I disappear, listen. Maribel's mouth went dry. Thaddeus stared at the sentence longer than he should have, because it didn't sound like a boast or threat. It sounded like someone trying to leave a door open behind them in case they didn't come back. They did the only sensible thing left. They slowed down and made choices that protected them first. Thaddeus took photographs of everything in place before anything moved. Then they selected only what they could justify as must-secure items, documents, recorder, passports, the old phone, because those things were evidence of something larger and more dangerous than a stack of cash. They left the big bundles where they were, not out of saintliness, but because hauling them out in broad daylight would turn them into targets before they understood who was already watching. Maribel wrapped the watch in a small tin of coins and an old scarf in the tote, not to sell immediately, but confirm value and authenticity with someone reputable, because guessing in the dark was how people got cheated or panicked. Before they closed the vault door, Thaddeus rewrapped the handgun exactly as he found it and placed it farther back. Not wanting it visible, they had to open the safe again with someone present. Then he pulled the heavy door shut and spun the dial through several full turns until the mechanism clicked into its locked hush. In that moment, with the safe sealed again, both of them felt a small relief mixed with new fear. The secret was back behind steel, but now the secret knew they existed. They locked the unit, drove home through gray winter light, and tried to let the road calm their hearts, but the sense of being followed clung to them like cold damp. At home, they didn't spread everything across the table the way people do in movies. They acted like neighbors might glance through a window at any moment. The folders went into a plain cardboard box. The passports and recorder went into a kitchen tin with flour sacks on top. The burner phone stayed off, placed in a ceramic bowl on the counter, as if distance could make it harmless. They spoke quietly, not because they believed someone could hear them through walls, but because raising their voices would make the fear feel louder. Maribel kept thinking about Christmas lights on the street and the way people smiled in grocery lines this time of year, and how strange it was that her own kitchen now held a sentence about disappearing. Thaddeus, who had always been the steady one, sat with his hands flat on the table and admitted, in a rare thin moment, that the call inside the safe was the detail he couldn't explain away. If someone could ring that phone, someone knew it existed, and if someone knew it existed, the safe had never been as hidden as they'd hoped. That thought was when the native habit of the modern world flashed in Maribel's mind, how their granddaughter always said that when something matters, people should subscribe and comment, so it doesn't vanish in silence. And Maribel almost laughed at the irony, because this was the opposite of that. This was something that had survived precisely because it stayed quiet. The next morning, they went out under a simple, practical cover story. They were getting appraisal before deciding what to do with an estate find. Thaddeus chose a small coin shop on the older side of town, the kind with a hand-painted sign, and a bell that chimed softly when you opened the door. The owner had careful hands and the calm eyes of someone who had seen every kind of desperation walk in, and he didn't rush them the way shady places do. He examined the coins under a loupe, checked dates and mint marks, weighed them, then opened the watch case and studied the movement long enough that Maribel's pulse climbed with every second. The numbers he offered were not fantasy, but they were real, and they were high enough that Maribel had to grip her purse strap to stay grounded. What unsettled Thaddeus wasn't the value. It was the owner's expression after he finished, a quiet tightening at the corners of his mouth as he slid the items back across the felt. He didn't accuse him of anything, but he said, gently and firmly, that pieces like these rarely come without a story, and that the story matters more than the gold. As they walked back to the car, Maribel noticed a gray sedan idling at the far edge of the lot, angled toward the exit, as if waiting for someone to leave first. She told herself it was nothing, but when they pulled out, the sedan followed at a distance that felt just a little too consistent for a coincidence. They didn't drive straight home. They made a slow loop through busier streets, past the holiday market and the post office, then turned into a public parking lot near a small community center, a place with cameras and foot traffic. The gray sedan rolled by once, paused at the stop sign longer than it needed to, then continued on, and Maribel finally let out the breath she'd been holding since morning. Thaddeus sat behind the wheel, thinking in the same structured way he once used to think through lock mechanisms. What did they know? What did they not know? And what decision reduced harm rather than gambling on pride? He didn't want the simplest version of help, the kind that brought flashing lights and neighbors' gossip, and the wrong people hearing the wrong details. He wanted careful help, the kind that understood evidence and discretion, because discretion was what had kept him safe so far. Back at home, he pulled one number from an old address book. An acquaintance from years ago who had worked investigations on the county side before retiring, a man who owed Thaddeus a small favor after a lock job that had once saved a records room from being destroyed. Thaddeus held the phone in his hand, staring at the digits, when the ceramic bowl on the counter began to rattle softly. The burner phone, still switched off, had lit up again on its own, vibrating like an insect trapped under glass, and the screen flashed the same words as before, "Unknown caller," as headlights swept across the living room wall from a vehicle slowing outside. Headlights washed across the living room wall in a slow sweep, bright enough to turn the Christmas cards on the mantel into pale rectangles. The burner phone kept buzzing in the ceramic bowl, stubborn and mechanical, as if it could shake itself free. Thaddeus didn't rush the window. He moved the way he used to when he felt trouble in a room, steady and quiet, keeping his body between Maribel and whatever waited outside. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, he saw a vehicle ease along the curb with its lights dimmed low, not parked like a neighbor stopping in, but hovering like someone checking an address. The engine didn't rev, and no door opened. Yet the car lingered long enough that Maribel's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter until her knuckles paled. The couple had lived through storms, layoffs, and long hospital waiting rooms. But this was a different kind of pressure, the kind that wasn't interested in their stories or their health, only in what had come out of that vault. When the car finally rolled forward and disappeared down the block, the quiet left behind felt staged, like a pause meant to force a decision. Thaddeus lifted the burner phone with 2 fingers, set it on the table, and let it ring again without answering, because obedience was exactly what whoever called expected, and he had no intention of giving them that comfort. The moment the buzzing stopped, he made the call he had been resisting since morning, not to a big office number, but to the old acquaintance in his address book, a retired county investigator who still believed in doing things carefully. The voice on the other end sounded sleepy at first, then sharp when Thaddeus kept the explanation simple and factual. A storage unit purchase, a vault safe, documents that looked official, fake passports, a recorder, and an unknown caller who somehow had access to the burner phone's line. The man didn't ask for gossip and didn't laugh, which told Maribel everything she needed to know about how serious it sounded to trained ears. He gave one instruction in a tone that felt like a hand on his shoulder. Do not meet anyone. Do not drive back to Yune alone. And do not try to sell anything else until someone credible had eyes on the paperwork. Then he asked for the address and storage facility name, and when Thaddeus hesitated, Maribel nodded once, because this was the first step that moved them away from being trapped in their own kitchen fear. Leave the phone on the table, the man said, and if it rings again, let it go, but record the screen and the time. He paused long enough to let the wave it land, and added, I'm coming by, and I'm bringing someone who still has a badge. When the call ended, the couple sat without speaking, listening to the furnace kick on and the distant sound of a holiday commercial from a neighbor's television, because it felt strange that the world outside could still be shopping and smiling, while their small home held a secret that was trying to reach back out into the dark. The visit happened under the cover of ordinary evening traffic, with porch lights glowing and inflatable snowmen swaying on lawns, as if nothing had changed. A plain sedan stopped in front of the house, and an older man stepped out first, shoulders squared in a familiar way, followed by a woman in a winter coat with a posture of someone who didn't waste movements. They kept their voices low, not because they were performing secrecy, but because older neighborhoods have ears, and the couple didn't need the wrong attention on top of everything else. The woman introduced herself with only a last name and a brief explanation that she handled sensitive property crimes and internal cases, the kind that intersected with corruption more often than people like to admit. Inside at the kitchen table, they laid out the evidence in careful stages, starting with the passports and recorder, then the ledgers and photocopy reports, and only after that, the photo of the burner phone's unknown caller, screen, and the times it had rung. The detective didn't gasp or moralize. She asked measured questions that made Maribel feel seen instead of judged, and she listened closely when Thaddeus described the gray sedan near the coin shop and the car that had hovered outside the house. When she reached the motel note, If I disappear, listen, she didn't comment on the drama of it, only on the practicality. This isn't a message for you, she said quietly, but it became your problem the moment you opened that safe. That one sentence steadied Thaddeus, because it framed the situation exactly as it was. Not a treasure hunt, not an adventure, but a responsibility they hadn't asked for. They moved from fear to plan in small, realistic steps, the way older people do when the world tries to speed them up. The detective explained what would happen if they handed over certain items, and what would happen if they didn't, using plain language instead of threats. Fake passports would be seized, full stop, because they were contraband and evidence. The recorder and microphone would be logged and examined for voices and dates. The ledgers and reports would be copied and cataloged, and if they tied to an ongoing investigation, the originals might be taken under warrant. But a receipt trail would document that the couple had come forward voluntarily. On the question of the money and valuables, she didn't offer a fantasy answer. She offered a careful one. Under auction law, the unit's contents were theirs in good faith, but anything proven stolen could later be claimed, and anything tied to active criminal conduct might need to be held temporarily while photographed and logged. You're not in trouble for opening what you legally bought, she said, and Thaddeus felt Maribel's shoulders loosen for the first time that day. The detective asked permission to clone the burner phone and set it up to capture future calls, and she offered them a simple choice that felt like dignity. They could keep the phone physically in the house, or they could let her take it and leave a decoy. Thaddeus chose the decoy without hesitation, because he wanted the threat pulled away from their dining room, away from their holiday candles and family photos, away from the life they were still trying to protect. By the following afternoon, the plan had shape and the tension returned in waves, because planning doesn't erase danger, only gives you a way to hold it. They drove to the storage facility with a retired investigator riding behind them in a sedan, not dramatic and not obvious, just present, and a detective arrived separately with another unmarked car that parked where security cameras could see it. The couple's unit sat at the far end again, cold metal roads and gravel crunching under their shoes, and Maribel hated how ordinary it looked now, as if the building itself were pretending nothing significant had ever happened inside. The detective photographed the door, the lock, the aisle, the safe, and every shelf inside the vault, working with a slow method of someone who knew that sloppy details destroy good cases. She didn't empty the safe like a thief. She documented, bagged, and labeled, leaving certain items in place after photos, so their arrangement could be explained later in court without guesswork. The handgun was handled carefully and clear without drama, then sealed as evidence with a simple nod, because no one needed to treat it like a showpiece. Thaddeus watched, feeling both relief and grief, because part of him had wanted the safe to be pure luck, a late-life blessing that asked nothing more than a trip to an auction house, and instead it was turning into a mirror held up to how ugly people can be when power and money mix. Halfway through the work, the detective glanced toward the lane and quietly asked if the couple had noticed a gray sedan that had rolled past twice. Maribel's stomach tightened, because she had, and she had tried not to. The sedan slowed a fraction the second time, and though its windows were tinted, it carried the same patient, measuring attention as a car outside their house. The retired investigator didn't rush after it. He lifted his phone and took a clear photo, then another, capturing the plate. "We're not chasing," he said, calm and firm. "We're collecting." That calm became contagious. Thaddeus understood, in a way that made him strangely emotional, that this was what support looked like in real life. Not applause, not noise, just people doing the unglamorous work of standing nearby, so the weak couldn't be pushed around quietly. It reminded Maribel of how their granddaughter always begged them to show support for things they cared about. Hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, because small actions keep good work alive. And here, in a gravel lot under winter clouds, she felt the same instinct rise, the urge to tell someone, somewhere, that careful courage deserves backing, especially when it's quiet and inconvenient. She didn't say it out loud, but it settled in her chest like a promise. If they got through this, they would not forget the difference between being alone and being supported. That evening, back home, the house felt warmer, not because the danger had vanished, but because the danger had been named and placed into someone else's hands with paperwork and witnesses. The detective had left them with a card, one number circled, and instructions that made sense. If anyone contacted them, they would not answer, they would save everything, and they would call that number first. She also left them with a reality that felt almost cruel in its simplicity. They might still be allowed to keep some of the valuables, but the process would be slow, and the holidays would not pause just because their week had turned strange. Maribel made soup, because routine was a kind of anchor, and Thaddeus fixed the loose hinge on the back door, because it gave his hand something honest to do. The burner phone, now a decoy, sat in its bowl again, silent for hours, until just after night settled and the neighborhood lights blinked on. Then it vibrated once, twice, and stopped, and a moment later it lit up again with unknown caller. But this time it didn't keep ringing. A voicemail notification appeared on the screen, like a small bruise. Thaddeus didn't press play immediately. He waited until Maribel sat beside him, until a retired investigator's number was already open on his own phone, until the kitchen felt as ready as it could be. When he finally played the message, a man's voice spoke in a calm, controlled tone that never raised itself into a shout, and that was what made it worse. "You opened what wasn't yours," the voice said. "Put everything back in the unit tonight, and no one has to get nervous." The message ended with a soft click, and on the screen, a second text arrived immediately after, only 6 words long. "Clean and final. We'll be watching the storage gate." The text message sat on the screen like a cold thumbprint, and for a few minutes the kitchen felt too small for the two of them to breathe normally. The threat wasn't loud, but it was specific, and specificity was what made Maribel's stomach tighten. The one mercy was that the couple no longer had to guess what kind of people they were dealing with, because decent people do not speak in deadlines and watch gates. Thaddeus set the phone down, wrote the exact time on a scrap of paper, and called the detective before the fear could turn into a bad decision. She didn't sound surprised, only focused, and she told him to keep the message, touch nothing else, and do exactly what older adults do best when the world gets reckless. Slow down and make it harder for mistakes to happen. She explained that the storage facility's cameras, gate logs, and lane angles could become their shield, but only if the couple stopped thinking like frightened targets and started thinking like witnesses. The plan came together in a few plain steps, none of them heroic, all of them practical. The decoy phone would stay where it could be seen, the real evidence would remain secure with her team, and the couple would not return anything at night because returning things was exactly how people got pulled into unlit corners. When the call ended, Maribel turned on the small lamp by the sink, not because it helped, but because she refused to let darkness be the mood in their home. Thaddeus checked the locks twice, then sat beside her, shoulders heavy, and for the first time in days they admitted the simple stake out loud without dramatics. If they handled this wrong, their quiet life could be shaken for a long time, but if they handled it right, they might finally be free. The next morning the world looked almost too normal, with holiday lights still blinking along gutters and the neighbor's wreath rocking gently in the wind. That contrast helped, because it reminded them what they were protecting. Not a stack of cash, not a watch, but the calm routines they had earned after decades of work and worry. The detective met them at a diner a few miles from the storage facility, a place with warm coffee and a cracked vinyl booth that made everything feel less like a movie and more like real life. She spoke in simple terms, letting them understand the logic without drowning them in procedure. The people making threats wanted control, and control required movement, which meant they would likely show up where the couple could be pushed or watched. The storage gate was their chosen stage, so the safest answer was to let the gate become a place where watching worked both ways. The facility manager had agreed to cooperate quietly after being shown a badge and a promise that his business would not be blamed for someone else's corruption. A plain surveillance unit would sit near the entrance, another farther down the row, and the couple would arrive exactly when the facility was busiest, with daylight still up and other renters coming and going. They would carry 2 bins that looked important and heavy, because the threat demanded a return, but those bins would hold nothing that could hurt anyone if stolen. The real valuables and papers were already photographed, logged, and secured, and the detective made a point to say it twice so Maribel could stop imagining someone snatching their whole future out of their hands. Thaddeus asked what happened if the watchers never showed, and the detective answered with the calm of someone who had seen patience with more often than force. Then nothing happened that day, and that would still be a kind of victory, because it would mean the couple stayed safe while the case kept building. On the drive home, snow began to fall and thin. Stubborn flakes that didn't stick at first, just drifted past the windshield like ash from a distant fire. Maribel watched the neighborhood slide by and felt that odd mix of gratitude and nerves that comes when strangers step in to help. She thought about how their granddaughter always said that support only works if people actually give it, that a small action, showing up, speaking up, staying engaged, keeps good things from disappearing under louder, uglier voices. Sitting beside Thaddeus, she felt that same truth in a sharper way now, because an older couple doesn't survive on strength alone. They survive on community and steady hands in the right moments. If anyone out there has ever followed a story like this and found themselves wanting to weigh in, the couple would have understood that instinct completely, because advice, comments, and simple encouragement can matter more than people admit when fear starts whispering. A like, a subscribe, a thoughtful comment about what you would do in their place. It's not magic, but it is a way of standing near someone without crowding them, and the feeling of not being alone can change how a person breathes. That thought didn't solve their problem, but it softened the edge of it, and that mattered. By the time they reached home, the plan felt less like a trap and more like a path, and they spent the afternoon doing ordinary things on purpose. Laundry, soup simmering, a short walk under gray sky, because normal life is a kind of armor when someone tries to drag you into panic. The day of the gate operation arrived with the kind of cold that turns every metal surface into a warning. Thaddeus loaded the decoy bins into the back of their sedan, placing them beneath a folded blanket, so they would look like private belongings rather than props. Mary Bell wore her warmest coat and the scarf their grandson had given her last Christmas, and she kept one hand in her pocket around a small set of prayer beads she rarely used but never threw away. At the facility, the manager greeted them with a polite nod that carried tension behind it, and he pointed them toward the main lane where other customers were already moving boxes and bicycles. The couple walked at their own pace, not rushing, not acting guilty, letting the ordinary noise of roll-up doors and distant radios be their cover. They stopped near their unit, and Thaddeus made a show of wrestling a bin to the ground, as if it were heavier than it was, while Maribel looked around the way any careful older woman would, eyes scanning without staring. 2 rows over, a gray sedan sat too neatly for a renter unloading junk, engine off, windows dark, the same kind of patient stillness they felt outside their home. A few minutes later, a second vehicle rolled in behind it, an SUV that didn't park so much as position itself, angled toward the exit. The detective did not appear, which was the point, because danger grows bold when it thinks it has found privacy. The couple stayed where the cameras could see them, and when the gray sedan's driver finally stepped out, he moved with the casual stride of someone trying to look like he belonged, but his eyes stayed fixed on the bins and the unit door, like a shopper counting cash in a stranger's cart. What happened next didn't explode. It tightened. The man from the gray sedan approached within a few yards and stopped, pretending to check his phone, then drifting closer again as if drawn by habit. Maribel kept her chin level and her hands visible, refusing to give him the satisfaction of flinching, while Thaddeus slid the unit key into the lock and paused, letting the moment stretch just enough. The man finally spoke in a low voice that tried to sound reasonable, not threatening, as if he were offering a simple correction to a mistake. "You got a message," he said, and it wasn't a question. Thaddeus didn't answer with an argument. He answered with calm, because calm steals oxygen from bullies. He lifted one bin as if to pass it over, just a few inches, then set it back down and turned slightly so the cameras could see his face. That tiny movement was the signal the detective had asked for, and within seconds 2 plainclothes officers stepped from between rows like they had always been there. The man's shoulders tensed, and he tried to step back toward the sedan. But another officer was already at the driver's side door, and the SUV's engine turned over in a sudden, nervous cough that gave itself away. No one tackled anyone, no one shouted, yet the air changed instantly, because control had shifted. The detective appeared last, walking in with her badge visible and her voice firm, telling the men to keep their hands where she could see them. The gray sedan man tried to explain, tried to frame it as just a misunderstanding, but the gate logs, the repeated slow passes near the couple's street, and the voicemail were already part of a larger pattern, and patterns are what real cases are built on. In the weeks that followed, the holidays arrived anyway, because life doesn't stop for investigations, and older people don't have the luxury of living only inside adrenaline. The couple gave their statements once, then again with an attorney present, and every time they told a story they kept it plain, because embellishment is how truth gets doubted. The detectives team confirmed what the ledger suggested. The safe had belonged to a retired officer who'd been skimming and trading influence for years, using seized valuables as personal inventory and storing leverage in a place where cameras didn't reach. The men who approached the couple were not strangers who happened to see a listing. They were connected to the same off-book web. And the moment the unit went to auction, they scrambled to regain what they believed belonged to their circle. That scramble was what exposed them. The recorder contained voices that matched old internal complaints, the passports tied to a document mill under investigation, and the phone's call history linked to numbers already flagged in another case. The couple didn't need to understand every detail to feel the outcome. The pressure that hovered over their home began to lift, not all at once, but steadily, like snow melting from a roof when the sun finally returns. The detective kept her promise about transparency, providing a written receipt trail for everything taken and a plain explanation of what could legally return to the couple once the evidence was copied and the stolen property checks were finished. Some cash was forfeited because it matched reported missing amounts, and the couple accepted that without bitterness, because they had never wanted dirty money. They had wanted a clean future. The coins and watch, however, were cleared after careful verification, And when that confirmation letter arrived, Maribel held it like it was more precious than the watch itself, because it meant their second chance wouldn't come with shadow attached. By early winter's end, they did what they had promised themselves they would do if luck ever landed in their lap. They handled it slowly and honestly. A reputable auction house cataloged the coins with proper grading. The watch went through a transparent sale. And the couple paid their taxes without trying to be clever, because peace costs less than fear in the long run. The total didn't turn them into rich people with flashy cars, but it did something better for two 70-year-olds who had learned to live tight. It put a thick cushion between them and the next emergency. They repaired the roof before spring rains, replaced a furnace that had been coughing for years, and paid off the last stubborn debt that had been following them like a small, persistent ache. They also set aside money for their granddaughter's education, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet correction to the family story, a way of saying that the future would not always be negotiated penny by penny. On Christmas week, with the case mostly settled and the house warm, they hosted a simple dinner for family and a few neighbors, nothing fancy, just good food and steady laughter, and Maribel noticed how different her husband looked when he wasn't calculating every cost in his head. The moral that settled over their table was not about treasure or risk. It was about integrity under pressure, about choosing help over secrecy, about understanding that the safest door to open is the one that leads you back toward community. Their story ended the way older hearts most need stories to end. Not with explosions, but with steadiness, with bills paid, with trust repaired, and with the quiet relief of going to bed on a winter night, knowing the shadows outside no longer had a reason to stop. The first snow that truly stuck came a week after the last signature dried, the kind that softens everything and makes even tired streets look forgiving. The couple woke to a hush that felt earned, not ominous, and for the first time in months the quiet didn't sound like waiting for the next shoe to drop. Maribel stood at the window with her mug warming her palms, watching a mail truck creep past the curb, and she realized her shoulders weren't up around her ears anymore. Thaddeus moved slower than he used to, but his movements had changed too, less guarded, less like he was bracing for a knock at the door. When the furnace kicked on, it did so without rattling, steady and even, and that simple sound became a small, private proof that the money they kept had turned into something real and safe, warmth you can count on, sleep you don't bargain for, and a home that finally felt like a shelter instead of a spreadsheet. They didn't tell the whole story to everyone, because older people know the difference between sharing and inviting trouble. Friends heard a gentler version, a storage unit, an old safe, some valuables sold properly, a bit of luck paired with a lot of paperwork. The parts that mattered most stayed between the two of them, how fear had tried to steer them into silence, how close they came to rushing, how their decision to ask for the right help had kept their lives from shrinking. When neighbors hinted at rumors, Thaddeus simply smiled and said they were grateful for a good outcome, then changed the subject to weather and grandkids. That restraint wasn't secrecy anymore. It was wisdom. They learned that peace grows best when it isn't constantly dragged into daylight for other people's entertainment. And they were finally at an age where they could choose peace without apology. The work of rebuilding their life came in plain steps that felt almost ceremonial. A contractor replaced the worst section of the roof and showed them the water damage that had been creeping along for years, the kind of slow problem that poor people tolerate until it becomes a crisis. They handled it before it became a crisis, and that alone made Maribel tear up in the driveway where the contractor couldn't see. Thaddeus replaced the worn tires on the car and then sat in the driver's seat with both hands resting on the wheel, as if the smoothness of it mattered. They paid off the last debt that had been quietly charging them interest, like a punishment for being ordinary. None of it was flashy, but each receipt they filed away felt like setting down a heavy bag they'd been carrying so long they forgot how it dug into their hands. As winter holidays rolled closer, the couple found themselves thinking less about what they had gained and more about what they had been spared. They had been spared the shame of cutting corners, the kind that poisons a home even when the lights are on. They had been spared the constant suspicion that someone could show up and claim their future wasn't really theirs. They had been spared the slow corrosion of living with a secret that makes you flinch at every siren. At church, at the grocery store, in the quiet moments between errands, Maribel noticed how many older faces carried their own private worries, and she felt a new tenderness for them. Luck wasn't what changed her. It was a reminder that anyone can get backed into a corner, and the way you climb out matters more than the corner itself. That was the moral that kept returning, gentle but firm. Money can repair things, but honesty repairs a person holding the money. One evening, the week before Christmas, they sat at their kitchen table with a small stack of envelopes, one for their granddaughter's education fund, one for a local veterans organization, one for the community pantry that had quietly helped their neighbors more times than anyone admitted. They didn't give until hurt, because they still respected the limits of age and fixed incomes, but they gave enough that it felt like closing a circle. Thaddeus said almost nothing as he wrote the checks, yet his hands looked steadier than they had in years, as if the act itself anchored him. Maribel set out cookies afterward and laughed at herself for overbaking, then laughed again because there was no dread underneath it. When their granddaughter called later, excited and breathless about school and friends, Maribel listened to that bright voice and thought about the storage unit one last time. Not as a mystery, but as the unlikely door that led them back to being present in the lives they loved. By the time Christmas morning arrived, the house smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and the only surprises were the good kind. They opened Simple Gift with family, took photos that weren't staged, and watched their granddaughter tear up when she realized the college envelope wasn't a promise. It was already real. Thaddeus stepped outside for a moment and looked at the pale sky, letting cold air fill his lungs, and he felt something close to gratitude for the long road that had brought him here without breaking his integrity. Back inside, Maribel set a hand on his shoulder as if to ground him, and in that touch there was a quiet message. They were safe, they were together, and their future was finally wider than their fears. Thanks for staying with their story to the end. If you felt something in it, hope, tension, relief, leave a like, subscribe for the next one, and drop a comment saying what you would have done when that phone call came and the easy choices started whispering. Your thoughts matter more than you think, and it helps keep stories like this alive for the people who need them most.